welcome to So You've Met a Trans Person, because you have now met a trans person, me. A couple of things before we start. You're not able to unmute yourself at the moment. That is by design, just so we don't have any interference or anything. When talking about the history of trans issues, I am going to be using some phrases that are perhaps a little bit outdated and antiquated. And I will be discussing transphobia later on as well, but I will issue relevant trigger warnings just beforehand, just so you know what you're in for, so no surprises. So without further ado, let me just introduce myself. If you could have the next slide, please. So my name is Joni, pronounced Joni, not Johnny. I use she, they pronouns, so she, her is correct, and they, them is correct. I came out as trans in 2013, aged 24. I was once the #1 Google image search result for angry trans woman, even though I'm not that angry. There was a news story the Evening Star ran on me that they then sold to the Daily Mail and the Daily Mirror and the Daily Star, and they still keep my photo on file and use it when they feel like it. In my job in real life, I'm a medical lab assistant for the NHS. I'm a cyclist, a very amateur stand-up comedian. I play guitar. I've been teaching myself violin. I'm a nerd. I'm a genderqueer lesbian. I'm non-binary, and I'm attracted to women and consider myself a lesbian. So moving on to the next slide, we're just going to go through some very basic terminology. Some of this you might have heard before, some of this you might not have heard before. And then we're going to discuss sort of some explanations of how it works. I think if you understand the meaning behind the prefixes and the words, you can kind of get a better handle on it. So when we're talking about people who are trans, you'll very often see the term born a man. And as I always say, if I was born a man, I would have split my mother in two because she's quite small. So we don't really talk about being born a man or born male. We talk about what's called assigned gender at birth. So standard course of action, you have a baby, comes out, they do the check between the legs, and they say, yep, you're in this box or you're in the other box. It's a gender that is assigned to you at birth. It's one of the issues with intersex rights, for example, is if you have one of a number of intersex conditions, you may have genitalia that is considered ambiguous. And so assigned gender can be really quite harmful to those people. Transgender just means it's somebody whose gender identity differs from that assigned to them at birth. So myself personally, I was assigned male at birth, gave it a go for 24 years, found it, no, the way I phrase it is I was pretending to be male for 24 years and it just didn't work for me. It just wasn't me, it wasn't who I was. The opposite of being transgender is being cisgender. So if your gender identity is the same as that assigned at birth, so the doc says, yep, that's a boy, and you go, yeah, I guess, sure, you would be cisgender. It's literally a terminology. There is no judgment based on that phrase. I know some people are a bit, I don't really need labels because I'm normal, and it's like, there is no normal. What is normal? Trans people, we can be considered unorthodox, perhaps. They're a small proportion of us in society, but we're not unusual. We're not weird. We are perfectly normal. The other term you might know is the term transsexual. Now, the term transsexual generally refers to somebody who is undergoing a medical transition. So that would involve hormone replacement therapy and or surgery. Not all trans people undergo those things. Some people undergo one, not the other, because of pre-existing conditions or whatever. It is considered outdated by some people, but it is a literal descriptor for other people. With any of these terminologies, it's one of those things where with anything within the LGBTQIA community, people very much use phrases as self-identifiers. And it is always best to ensure that you respect how somebody identifies, whether that's regards their sexuality or their gender identity. So some people would consider themselves transsexual. Some people would be deeply uncomfortable with that term. So going into the sort of the language of it, Cis and trans are prefixes. They are short snippets you can put on front of a word. Cis, it comes from Latin, means on the same side of. So in this case, someone's gender being the same as that assigned to them at birth. Trans meaning across or on the far side of, so being different. So you weren't expecting a chemistry lesson, were you? But here we go. So these are diagrams of molecules. I drew them myself. Art is my passion. And you can kind of see this, it's known as stereoisomerism, and the prefix is used for these because it denotes which side the functional group, in this case the CH3 you can see there. In a cis isomer, it's on the same side of. On a trans isomer, it's on the opposite of. So you can kind of see there with the language, how the language around gender has formed from the prefixes that come from a long time ago. Using that same logic, we can go to the next slide. So a trans man would be a man whose gender identity is different to that assigned to them at birth. So think about the molecule there on the right, different side. Gender has the opposite side of the molecule. A cisgender woman would be a woman whose gender identity is the same as that assigned to them at birth. That would be the left of the two molecules. Okay, so moving on, let's talk about the gender binary. So in Western society, particularly 19th century onwards, there is a very rigid belief that gender is a binary, which I've illustrated here. Two boxes, male, female, you're in one or the other, not both, not neither. You have to be in one or you have to be in the other. Now that works for some people, and that works for some transgender people. Some transgender people do find that the way they describe gender is in a binary manner. They find that works for them. However, there are others who find that doesn't fit for them, and they would talk more about gender being a spectrum. So here I've got a selection of different identities that I'm just going to talk through. So if I can have the first 5, that would be fabulous. There we go. So there's a lot of talk in the press and a lot of criticism, people saying, oh, you know, there's 500 genders now, and oh, it's just ridiculous. And it can be a lot to get your head round, definitely. I know when I first came out, you know, a friend of mine sort of went, oh, you know, this, and just blew my mind a little bit. And I was like, oh, what? What we're talking about here is we're talking about people's experience of gender, which is a very many-splendid and ephemeral kind of thing. It's a very ineffable thing. It can be hard to put words to sometimes, but I think it's extremely harsh to deny somebody's opportunity to define their experience as a human being. So let's talk about some of these identities. They're non-binary identities, meaning they're outside of the binary of male and female. So some of them are a combination of the two, such as bigender, for example. Some have elements of male, such as masculine. So some people would say they are transmasculine. Some would say they're transfeminine, elements of femininity in there. Neutral, for example, is a description of someone's gender that is an absence of gender. They don't feel an attachment to a gender at all. And then gender fluid is a gender that fluctuates. So that can be based on the time of year, perhaps, for some people, or just how they're feeling. That's just how people experience gender. And I know as a cis person speaking to cis people and speaking to family and friends and colleagues, it can be quite difficult to get your head around. But what we're talking here is just somebody's perception of how they feel in terms of their gender. If we could have the other ones there, Dara, please. This is, as I say, their non-exhaustive list. There's a multicolored galaxy. There's so many. If you're curious, you know, this PowerPoint will be available. Go and look some of them up. You know, yeah, there's a lot of them essentially. So if we can flick to the next slide. here's another way of putting it, an artist far better than me with my little squiggles. So on the top there, you've got the idea of gender being sort of a line. When talking about the gender binary, that would just be two separate bits. And sort of there's a sliding line between male and female. And then at the bottom, you can kind of see something that's more three-dimensional, more points in which one can exist and one can experience their gender in, if you find that the gender binary doesn't work for you. So next up, just if we stay on this slide for a minute, next up, what I'm going to do is I'm going to discuss how the terminology involved fits within things. It's very much a not all A's are B's kind of thing. It's a little bit like explaining the structure of the United Kingdom to an American. When you kind of say like, so we've got England and we've got Wales and we've got Scotland, and that's all the United Kingdom, and there's Great Britain. And anyway, so if we can go to the next slide. So what we've got here is umbrellas under umbrellas, because I just like the word umbrella. It's a lovely word to say, isn't it? So at the top there, you've got what we could call the transgender umbrella. So that covers a wide range of identities. So it covers binary trans men, binary trans women. So people who experience a gender, their gender is opposite to that they were assigned at birth, but they experience it in a binary manner. It would involve transsexual people who may also be binary trans man or a binary trans woman. It includes people who cross-dress as well. So people who wear clothes of the opposite sex, for a multitude of different reasons. And that can be a bit of a contentious one. And there is some difficulty in overlap in that, you know, as a trans person, as a trans feminine person, trying to get people to understand that trans women are not drag artists. There is a gulf of difference between the two, is a whole thing. And then underneath the transgender umbrella, you have another umbrella, the non-binary umbrella. So non-binary people, for them, a lot of them, I don't want to speak in absolutes, if you understand me. Non-binary people are transgender in that their gender identity differs from that assigned to them at birth. So under the umbrella there, you can see a variety of different non-binary identities. So it's the not all A's are B's thing, where a lot of non-binary people are transgender. Some transgender people are non-binary. Not all transgender people are non-binary. So I hope that kind of helps. It's just like quite a useful thing to kind of keep in your head there. And then finally, in this little segment here, I would like to, what I call Lighthouse talk to trans people at parties or anywhere, the bus stop, or, well, wherever. If you find yourself talking to a trans person, this is how to do it. And don't panic. Don't panic. It'll be okay. It's very simple. It's very, very simple. Okay. So first thing, use their name. Please don't ask our birth name. In my case, it's a name I haven't used for 8 years. I don't really have terribly large attachment to it. And I don't think anyone really needs to know it. Step 2, use their pronouns. So pronouns are the way that somebody is, the way you would describe somebody without using their name. So my friend Alex, she is sitting on the sofa over there. She uses she, her pronouns. There is some contention, unfortunately, about the use of gender neutral pronouns in society. That would be they, them. Some people argue essentially that, no, that's ridiculous. One person can't use they. Well, they can. It's been in use since, I believe, 1526 as an individual pronoun. You know, is that their coat? That is using they, them as an individual pronoun, for example. So yeah, and then step 3, talk to them like you would anyone else. That's like literally it. That's like the 3. If you take nothing home from this other than this is the 3 things that trans people would very much like people to do. Baseline, This is the baseline of being good and proper to trans people, is using their name, using their pronouns, talking to them like they would anyone else. Just like we make sure we use anyone's pronouns, you know? Like the example that I frequently see discussed is you're in the park and you see someone's dog and you go, oh my God, that's a lovely dog. What's his name? And they go, actually, it's a her. And, oh, sorry. I think the other thing as well is if you make a mistake, if there is a trans person, has transitioned in the time you've known them, it can be difficult to adjust to that being a new name. It's a thing. Like when I first came out, I would find myself describing myself in my old gender. If you mess up, it's okay. It happens. As long as you're trying, that's the main thing. And just apologize briefly and move on. That's the simplest thing. The last thing any transgender person really wants is a massive dramatic mea culpa where you apologize profusely over and over across the course of the day. All that's required is a very simple, brief apology, and you're good. Just keep trying. You'll get there. As long as you're trying, that's the main thing. Like I know in the media, and it's something I go into later. Trans people are described as being the very demanding, insisting on these things and telling people, policing language and telling people how to speak. I mean, I think everybody has a right to police language about how they are spoken about in terms of who they are. But ultimately, we're not like heartless. You'll mess up. It happens. Move on. It'll be fine. Okay, so there endeth the introduction to trans people and how to talk to us at parties, and a brief chemistry lesson. I'm sorry if I've caused any horrific high school flashbacks for anybody there. If I could please have the next slide. So moving into the second section, it's going to be a brief history of trans people, focusing on the UK, but a few mentions of other places where it's relevant, essentially. As I said, I will be using some slightly outdated terminology where there is no way of avoiding it. So if I could have the next slide, please, that'd be fantastic. Thank you. So I have two thesis statements here, and maybe thesis statement is too fancy a word, but I have two statements here. The first one is that trans people have existed in almost every society throughout history. If you look, you find them everywhere. So some examples here, which go through long-standing societal traditions. If I could have the next box, please. Thank you. So there are Native American Two-Spirit people and First Nations in Canada and America. You have South Asian Hijira culture, Samoan Fa'afafine, gender identity within the Dagaba people of Ghana, Burkina Faso, and Ivory Coast, which is, from what I can understand from the reading I've done at least, is a group of people, and they experience gender not as something assigned at birth, but more as something based on energy as such. I mean, we're using Western words to describe something that is not Western, and so I really hope I'm not failing in describing that, and I'm really not intending to be colonial and coming from that point of view. Additionally, there's a multitude of genders within the Jewish tradition. The Torah lists, I believe it's 6 or 7 different genders, including male and female. So that's my first point. If you look for it, it's there. And it covers the very basic definition of transgender that I laid down at the start, which is living as a gender that is different to that assigned to you at birth, at least by traditional Western standards where gender is assigned at birth. If I could have the next slide, please. Part 2 of that is going to be that trans people have always existed through time. So if you look way back, we're there. There are limitations, and I will talk about that in a minute. So one of the earliest examples that I know of is what's called the Prague 6 gravesite, which is from approximately 4,700 years ago, near Prague, as the name would suggest. And it is a gravesite of somebody who has what would be considered a typically male skeleton. And they are buried as a woman in female clothes with all the trappings and ceremonial inclusions of being female. And these particular people, they were real sticklers for how you bury people. It was, obviously burial procedures throughout history are a very serious kind of thing. It's taken very seriously. And this is ultimately a good case for that. This is probably the grave of somebody who was perhaps would have been assigned male at birth by today's standards, but lived as female and was buried as female. Elegibus was a Roman. I see her described as a Roman emperor, but that strikes me as, well, she insisted on being referred to as a lady. She wore wigs, makeup, shaved her hair, which in ancient Roman is not a thing apparently. And she lived as a woman, was considered a woman. She actually sought out gender reassignment surgery in the 3rd century, which my friend does tell me that there were not gender reassignment surgeries, but there were very early cosmetic genital surgeries performed in Rome, which I definitely want to know more about because that sounds fascinating. Next up, I've got 3 figures from the UK. The earliest example I can find of somebody who I would consider trans by that very simple definition would be Eleanor Reichner. Eleanor Reichner was an embroiderer and a sex worker. She was arrested in 1395 for soliciting in London and was interrogated and imprisoned. Her interrogation is in Latin and has that really old school squiggly writing that's really hard to read anyway. And she didn't speak Latin. She then went on to work as an embroiderer in Oxford before returning to sex work. A lot of the discussion around her discusses her being involved in sort of ruses where she was working with another woman and her daughter would sleep with men. And then when the man was asleep, Eleanor would replace her, being much older, and would then claim a sort of essentially extortion or blackmail money. But which, a lot of the dialogue around Eleanor Reichner focuses on this occupational being a woman for the purposes of sex work. But as I said, she went to Oxford to become an embroiderer, to work as an embroiderer. Back then that was woman's work. There were no male embroiderers, and she continued to live as Eleanor Reichner whilst an embroiderer. Last up is Mary Mudge. Oh no, wait, no, one in the middle there. Got James Barry, if you can just put the little drawing up as well. So this is James Barry. James Barry was a doctor and a trans man. Absolutely fascinating character. Transitioned in his 20s, I believe. Is that right? Yep, transitioned in his 20s, went to medical school, became a surgeon quite high up in the British Army. Had beef with Florence Nightingale. Florence Nightingale met him and said he was the most black-hearted blackguard she'd ever met. Apparently, he would throw medicine bottles at people he didn't like, which seems quite harsh. And his dog, you can see his dog in the drawing there. My friend Alex drew this. His dog was called Psyche, and they were completely inseparable. James Barry died in 1865, about 6 years after he retired from military service as a surgeon. And it was revealed after his death that he had been assigned female at birth. It was revealed by a charwoman who was somebody who would prepare people after death for burial. And she tried to extort a friend of Barry's, essentially. Barry had insisted that there was to be no examination of his body after death, and he continued to live as a man after he retired, which is beyond when he had to. So you can kind of see what I'm saying here. You can see a picture forming here. The third character we don't know much about, similar to Eleanor Reichner, led a pretty unremarkable life. Her name is Mary Mudge. She was a dairy maid in Dorset, I believe, and she died aged 85 and was revealed to have been assigned male at birth after she died. We don't know much else about her. There was no records of her birth. And apparently the locals were just like, well, that's Mary. She's quite big for a woman, but that's just Mary. She was just accepted as a woman, you know, until after her death. If we can go on to the next slide here, I just want to talk about difficulties in historical study. Now, the first issue here is that queer history is folk history. Queer history in terms of the verb to queer, in terms of going against the grain, talking about queer theory kind of thing. So when you look at the history of it, a lot of historical transgender people were just ordinary folks, like Mary Mudge. She was a dairymaid for most of her life, and that wasn't of note to anybody because there are a lot of dairymaids, I guess. Being trans required living your gender identity privately. Now, the conventions of the time in terms of dress and in terms of how one lived made that somewhat easier, but it was necessary to be entirely under the radar. It's something we in the community refer to as living stealth, which is being trans and not disclosing your trans status. So little was written by these historical figures about their gender identity. We don't know how they felt about gender. James Barry is a perfect example of this. He lived a completely private life. There was an incident where Barry was accused of homosexuality during his time in the military and went through, I believe, some kind of court-martial procedure. It was a full investigation. And now he could have come out and gone, well, actually, no, technically it's not if there was something going on, it wouldn't be homosexuality because, you know, actually, but he didn't. And in some ways, he certainly couldn't. And then the last point I've got is that much of the history is lost to time. We don't know how many trans folks there were way back when. We can see that they definitely exist from these three cases I've just cited, going back to the 14th century. But much of it's lost to time. The only reason we know about Eleanor Reichner is because she got arrested and she was interrogated. And there's a record of that. And you find this throughout history, particularly when you look at trans figures, particularly trans figures who worked as sex workers, which for some of them may have been the only work available to them. You can see that the only records we have are records of them being persecuted, them being imprisoned, them having run-ins with the law, and them being arrested. There's another case I'm going to talk about shortly that's a similar kind of thing. If I can have the next two boxes, that would be lovely, Darren. Thank you. Now, the vocabulary is different or didn't exist. And this is definitely an accurate argument. The word transgender was first used in, I believe, 1967. There were previous words, some of which we'll go into. And so labeling historical characters with contemporary terms there is a degree of dissonance there. So at the same time, I would argue in all three cases here, they lived a gender that was different to that which they were assigned at birth. And what's more, they had the opportunity to live as the gender they were assigned at birth, but didn't. Eleanor Reichner continued to live as a woman and seek work as an embroiderer. James Barry continued to live as a man after his retirement. And yeah, I mean, that's that. There are difficulties in it, but that's ultimately my point when looking at queer history and when looking particularly older history that isn't as documented in terms of photos and print media and reportage, stuff that's beyond living memory, a couple of generations, maybe even 10 generations beyond living memory. So that's just something I would like to just kind of say, I guess. If I could have the next slide, that would be fantastic. So going into the 20th century, or late 19th century into the 20th century, let's talk about early research into trans people. You may notice these are 3 relatively beardy white men, because they were always relatively beardy white men at the time. We have 3 guys here. We have Richard von Krafft-Ebing. He wrote Psychopathia Sexualis, which laid down invert theory. Now, invert theory was more of a theory about sexuality, that suggested that gay men, for example, were in fact women in men's bodies, and that therefore the urges they felt were in fact heterosexual, but they were in the wrong body. It's widely, it's obviously widely not really considered at all accurate these days, but it is worth noting. It's an important part of early 20th century LGBTQIA history. It's mentioned, and Psychopathia Sexualis specifically is mentioned in Radcliffe Hall's The Well of Loneliness, which is a very early piece of lesbian literature, where there's a character called Stephen, who is assigned female at birth, there are trans readings of it that can be made, but it is based on Radcliffe Hall's knowledge of invert theory, and Radcliffe Hall, fabulous, top hats, tuxedos, amazing person. Next up, you have Magnus Hirschfeld. Now, I'm going to go into Magnus Hirschfeld in a little bit more detail. He wrote extensively on homosexuality and trans people, and he founded the Institute for Sex and Wissenschaft in Berlin. Sorry if there's any German speakers here, I probably butchered that. Last up, we have Havelock Ellis. He wrote the first English language medical textbook on homosexuality. The other 2 are German, I believe. He coined the term eonism for trans people, referring to the Chevalier d'Eon, who was a French spy from the 17th century. She would fence, she was assigned male at birth, lived as a male for a large period of time. As a spy, she infiltrated the Russian court, and shortly afterwards found that living as a woman was for her, and continued to live as a woman. She would fence against men whilst dressed in 16th century French gowns. Part of how she got on so well was basically she had a vineyard in France, and she would basically bribe British politicians with wine. Absolutely incredible woman, like total badass. Havelock Ellis as well. Curiously, there is a Suffolk connection. Havelock Ellis died in Hindlesham, which is very curious. Both Magnus Hirschfeld and Havelock Ellis were gay. Richard von Krafft-Ebing, I am not sure about, and I don't think many historians are entirely sure about. So let's talk a little bit more about Magnus Hirschfeld. So he was one of the first, if not the first, research into transgender people. And he was generally a pretty amazing person in terms of his work. When you look at his vast body of work, he just seemed to be very on point when it came to unfairness. He was the first person to separate transgender people from homosexuals in classification. To go, no, these are 2 separate things. Which admittedly, that's something we still face today. When you look at some of the claims by some doctors, such as Ray Blanchard and his theory of autogynephilia, it's based on us being latent homosexuals. It's rubbish. He was also the first person to make a distinction between transgender people and intersex people, and go, no, actually, these are 2 separate things and need to be treated in different manners. The institute that he set up in Berlin became a real refuge for trans people. There were rooms where they could stay. They were given jobs within the institute, admittedly often quite menial tasks like kind of secretary or maid, but they were given jobs. Certificates were issued, giving patients the site some protection from police harassment for cross-dressing, as it would have been seen. These were known as, and forgive the term, they were known as transvestite certificates. And you can see one here on the left there. You can see at the top there, the Institute for Sex Education. If you've seen the Danish girl, Lily Elbe, stayed at the Institute. I believe she had at least one of her surgeries there. On the right here, this man on the left was a patient at the Institute. And yeah, it's really awesome stuff. And when you look at Magnus Hirschfeld as well, he actually did a lot of activism around early feminism and did a lot of activism about dispelling myth, sort of racist colonial myths around physical differences between different people from around the world. So going into a little bit horrible bit of racist history, but there's a lady whose name is Alice, who was brought to the UK as the Hottentot Venus. I believe it's quite an offensive term, and was displayed nude in front of people and kind of put around. And one of the theories that was put about at the time in sort of papers was that the women of the particular tribe that she came from had enlarged labia, which led them to have a predilection for lesbianism. And Hirschfeld came along and was like, that's a load of rubbish. You're talking absolute rubbish there. How about you don't? He also fought against what was termed in the US, and again, forgive the phrase, the yellow peril. And yeah, so it seems to have been a pretty good bloke. Unfortunately, moving on to the next slide, in 1920, he was almost beaten to death by Volkish activists, Volkish being sort of proto-Nazis. He was persecuted by the Nazis as a Jew and as a gay man. And then in 1933, the Institute of the Sexualwissenschaft was raided by the Nazi SA. That's the paramilitary branch of the Nazi party, the brown shirts. Records were taken, people were rounded up. This photo you can see on the right, which is quite a famous photo of a Nazi book burning, amongst other things that are being burnt there, are very early research and records of transgender people from the clinic. And of course, all of this is naturally a prelude to the Holocaust, where, of course, approximately 10 to 15,000 gay men, lesbians, and also trans people were imprisoned and murdered. It's dark history, but I feel it's important to talk about contextually within this kind of thing. Sorry to bring the mood down a little bit. Moving on, looking at depictions of trans people in the early 20th century, particularly through media, so newspapers, because that's the only thing we've got left. You know, radio wasn't recorded. Early depictions were very much of the kind of stiff upper lip, well, fancy that kind of variety. There was very little editorializing from what I could see of the articles I've read. Now, it's difficult to access a lot of things. So 2 cases here. Paul Downing, who you can see a photo of on the left here, that is in fact a photo of Paul Downing. I haven't been able to track down very much information on Paul Downing, but he was arrested on Blackfriars Bridge in London after chasing buses looking for his wife. Born in the US, he'd been working as a sailor and had been all the way around the world. We don't know if he had a wife. It's entirely possible he may have had a wife. Again, it's lost to history. All we have is a 1905 newspaper article and a photo of a photo. He was unfortunately incarcerated in an asylum as a vagrant lunatic, where he died a year later. And I think this is the thing, is like the media depiction in the early 20th century is this, well, fancy that. And you see cases like Mary Mudge, where trans people were tolerated within places if they were stealth and under the radar. But you can very much see how these people had to be under the radar, how they had to live stealthily, and how these people were criminalized and institutionalized. Colonel Victor Barker, guy on the right there, also known as Sir Victor Barker and Sir Colonel Victor Barker. He was in fact not a sir and was not a colonel, nor was he a captain. as he once suggested. He transitioned during World War One and served in the Royal Air Force. He was imprisoned at first for 9 months for lying on a marriage certificate, and was then outed when a company he made had gone bankrupt. There's a musical about him. Someone's written a musical, which I'm dying to see. There was a very awesome woman with a ukulele who played a gig at the library a couple of years ago. Me and Leo went to, and it was, yeah, and she talked a lot about Colonel Barker. Now, again, going back here to my initial point about the difficulty in studying trans history, Victor Barker continued to live as a man until his death in Suffolk. Again, Suffolk connection, what? He died as Geoffrey Norton in Kessingland. He partook in a stand-up show. He partook in a very strange kind of circus sideshow where he was put in a sort of circular amphitheater where you could view him from above with Belisha beacons between him and a woman. It was very strange. He's very much worth reading about. There is a certain amount of stuff about him. And it is interesting because his narrative, you know, talks about how there were more opportunities for him. He was frustrated during World War One by the lack of his ability to partake and help living as a woman, and so he did transition, ostensibly within the narrative for that purpose. But again, I would argue he continued to live as a man beyond his need to, eventually dying as Geoffrey Norton, unknown, essentially, in Kessingland, Suffolk. Again, yeah, worth reading about. Moving on, we're going to come into the middle of the 20th century, come into the 30s and the 40s. By 1933, Lily Elb's book, Man to Woman, had been translated and released in English. Vaginoplasties were possible. 1953, Christine Jorgensen came out in the United States. You may have seen the headline, I believe it's XGI becomes blonde bombshell. She was the first very, very public, very known trans figure, particularly when it comes to things like estrogen and vaginoplasty surgery. Curious that estrogen then was known as Premarin. It was taken from the urine of pregnant horses, as the Marin bit would suggest. We've come a long way. It's synthetically produced now. We don't need to go to those lengths, fortunately. Fun fact. And so we have here in these photos the UK's own version of Christine Jorgensen. It's Roberta Cowell. Now, Roberta Cowell was a fighter pilot during World War II, Spitfires. She was a racing car driver, additionally. She was a figure of minor aristocracy. You may be able to see the writing there in that article in the middle, with her mother, Lady Croydon. And she went sort of public about her transition and discussed, she discussed some of the thing. And this is the thing is moving on to this, when you look at medical transition, there was a real focus, media focus on this. Wonders of the modern science age. Look at this. He became a woman. Isn't that, you know? And it's got this sizzle of fascination, but with this undercut edge of, well, don't know about that. Again, very little editorializing in some of these stories. Yeah. But ultimately, you do start to see a change into the middle of the 20th century, where you do start to see people being outed against their will. Some we're going to talk about the next two figures. So moving on, this is a Michael Dillon, who was a surgeon, heir to a baronetcy, and a trans man. He transitioned in 1939, starting testosterone from a doctor who was experimenting with it in cis women for excessive menstrual bleeding. Something you kind of see quite a lot with trans people is they give us drugs that have been used on cis people for quite some time, very often. the doctor who prescribed him testosterone insisted he'd see a psychiatrist. And he went, yeah, sure. Went along to see a psychiatrist. And the psychiatrist gossiped about his transition. And so he moved to Bristol. He started working in a garage. And pretty soon with the changes that testosterone caused, he, passed as a man. The term pass is a phrase used to refer to a trans person's ability to appear as a binary gender. So Christine Jorgensen, for example, yeah, it's a thing. He was a fire watcher during the Blitz in World War II. He was diabetic and had 2 incidents where he had low blood sugar, hit his head and sustained a head injury. It was the second of these where he was in hospital in London, where he had a chance meeting with a plastic surgeon who performed a double mastectomy and recommended him to a surgeon called Harry Giles. Now, I didn't want to include any graphic photos here. Harry Giles was a revolutionary plastic surgeon who initially worked during World War I on people who were sustaining incredibly horrific burns due to the new fuel mixes and weapons of war, essentially. And he developed these amazing techniques of early skin grafting and creation of missing noses and so on and so forth. If you have a stomach for it, it is truly worth checking out, certainly. Harry Giles performed a phalloplasty on Michael Dillon. So that's a creation of a penis, a surgical creation of a penis. First that we know of worldwide. It took 6 operations, I believe, between 1946 and 1949. I have a thing for detail. Harry Giles would later perform a vaginoplasty on Roberta Cowell. And Michael Dillon, as a surgeon, also performed an orchidectomy on Roberta Cowell, curiously. That operation, so an orchidectomy, sorry, forgive me, is a removal of the testes, surgical removal of the testes. That surgery technically was illegal at the time. It was illegal for Michael Dillon to perform that. And the legend goes that he performed it on his kitchen table, probably surgically scrubbed down, I imagine. But yeah. Dillon went on to write a book called Self, A Study in Ethics and Endocrinology. He didn't discuss his transition. He wasn't out as a trans person. He was eventually outed by the Sunday People, I believe, in quite a salacious story. Essentially, being heir to a baronetcy, being minor aristocracy, there's sort of a list of who's going to get what, who's going to inherit what. And there's these 2 almost like phone books of the aristocracy kind of thing without the phone numbers. And Dillon had written to one of them and said, amendment, you need to include me here. That's a mistake. And he assumed the other one would follow suit. The other one didn't, and kept his birth name in there. And the discrepancy was noted by a journalist who then turned it into a massive story. I wasn't able to find any of the newspaper articles about it, unfortunately. And yeah, facing a massive amount of media scrutiny, Dillon moved to India, where he became a Buddhist monk, writing a large number of texts on Buddhism. So yeah, kind of interesting. So let's recap here. Let's look at where we're at with trans status by the 1950s. So I realize I've been talking for quite a while. I hope this is interesting. So research on trans people was being done, but it was focused very much around confessional medical interviews. It was, very much based on, doctor, I think I'm a transsexual. Ah, cool, yes, wonderful. Tell me about your mother, that kind of thing. Trans-affirming healthcare was available, HRT and surgery was available privately to some people. We're talking about like Harley Street clinics here, the real high-end stuff, which, both Roberta Cowell and Michael Dillon, notably, both aristocracy, both have money, have connections. Coverage in media is based around outing people and say sensationalizing, which is something we're going to see with our next figure. Most trans people living under the radar, living stealth, as we call it. Gender identity is still distinctly binary and also tied to traditionalist values of male and female, also tied to being straight, because homosexuality is still illegal. So, you know, in a sort of a bind, trans people at the time were able to sort of be like, well, you know, I'm trans. I'm not gay though. You know, they could be out in their gender identity, but yeah. And with Roberta Cowell, notably, and also I believe Michael Dillon, they were able to change their birth certificate, which is notable, because we're going to talk about someone else now, a model called, oh no, we're not. That's the slide after this one. Pause for lemonade. So, John Randell and the Charing Cross Clinic. Charing Cross Clinic hasn't actually been at Charing Cross for a long time, since 1973, which has caused a large number of people to miss appointments. Hi, Jem. And it's moved again now, and it's in, I believe, North London. Anyway, it was founded in 1959. It was a collaboration between John Randell, a Welsh surgeon, and a urologist whose name completely escapes me. And it was the idea, it was a clinic that was came to be dedicated towards giving trans people gender affirming surgery. It's something that Randell had been doing some time through his clinic in Harley Street. Randell's a very, very divisive figure in the trans community. There's a wonderful book called Trans Britain by Christine Burns, who's an MP. And Randell is known for being very brusque, very harsh, and really imposing very strict rules on people. These rules were, as I say here, strict. So feminine presentation, you had to be able to pass. So you had to, you know, Randell would look at you and go, yes, I reckon I can see you as a woman. Yes. You had to be straight. And the real life test had to be passed. Now, the real life test was living for 2 years at least as the gender you were transitioning to, without any medical assistance, so fighting your biology on a daily basis, not having any hormonal support, outing yourself to people. You had to have a stereotypically feminine or masculine job, and you had to have a job. And they'd phone up and check. But the thing is there were no protections in law at this time for trans people. You could be fired for transitioning. You could be fired just for being trans. So people were walking a very fine tightrope, and I can't imagine the fear that these people must have lived in of being outed. A lot of the people who discuss the early years and sort of transitioning in the 50s, 60s, and 70s in Christine Burns' book very much talk about this fear and this climate and sort of being very insular and very alone. And some of these elements of Randell's time there still stick. He left in 1982 when he died at the age of, I believe, 52 of a heart attack. I myself, I had my first appointment with the Gender Identity Clinic in 2016, I believe. And I had to undergo the real life experience, they call it now. It's not a test anymore, it's an experience now. Not quite as good as the Jimi Hendrix experience, but there you know. And I had to live for 2 years as a woman, pre-HRT, pre any assistance from the clinic. They were known to phone up people's work to double check that they weren't lying to them. I had to bring evidence that I'd changed my name to my first clinic. So you're going to a hospital appointment and you're panicking that you forgot to bring the gas bill that's in your name. It's like, it's seriously surreal. It's very strange. And not gonna lie, it kind of sucks. One thing as well here, minor footnote, until at least 1971, Randell was offering trans women who were pre-transition conversion therapy, or you know, to use the more general term, aversion therapy, which I'm sure many of you know what it is. It's presenting people. So Within the clinic, Randell would ask the patients to give him photos of them dressed as the gender they were transitioning to, and electroconvulsive therapy would be given to them whilst looking at those photos, or an emetic would be given to them. It's pretty grim stuff, and it's still in living memory. We're not that far from this. And a lot of the difficulties that we still face in terms of medical gatekeeping still exist out of this. It's great, it's there. I love it. You know, however, there are problems that are still yet to be addressed. Next slide, please. April Ashley, a model and a transgender woman. She was outed in the Sunday People in 1961. A friend of hers went, pardon me, terribly sorry, went to the press and said, hey, you know that model? She's trans. And that was a sensational story at the time, of course. She married the heir to a lordship, the Honourable Arthur Corbett, lots of bits after his name, and third Earl of Baron of whatever. Didn't last very long. They divorced in 1964. In 1967, Ashley claimed for maintenance payments to keep her in the life she was used to. Corbett filed countersuit, claiming the marriage was void from the start. John Randell gave evidence in that case. Essentially, the divorce case, the counter claim claiming that the marriage was void, came down to Ashley being legally considered a man. Now, this was a legal precedent that hadn't been set in court before. Previously, trans people have been able to change their birth certificates and ultimately change their gender. Ashley had done so, but was essentially the short story. The short version is she asked for payments, and in order to get her payments, Corbett claimed that the marriage was void. Corbett knew about her trans status before they started dating. John Randell gave evidence in the court case, stating that Ashley was, and again, forgive the language, properly classified as a male homosexual transsexualist. You can see here the Sunday People article. Notice the weasel marks, as I believe they're termed in the industry, around the word her. Yeah. So moving on, you might be wondering why I'm talking about a divorce case between a trans woman and a lord or heir to a lordship. This case had a huge impact, possibly the biggest impact on transgender people that has been felt to this day, basically. So it restated, for starters, that marriage was between a man and a woman. That dates back to the 1850s, I believe, but it was restated in law in 1969. It was also stated it was legally impossible to change sex, making it impossible to change gender on birth certificates for intersex and trans people. This was the case until 2004. It took 40 years of trans people not being able to change their birth certificates, and therefore being able to have their gender on display and their transition be traced perpetually. The judge instituted a medical test and definition of Ashley's being, quote unquote, a man, citing 4 factors that you can see there. Now, of those 4, transsexualism, again, forgive the language, was considered to be a psychological factor. And this goes into some of why gender identity and trans-affirming healthcare has continued to be treated as a psychological or psychiatric issue rather than an endocrine issue, which ultimately trans-affirming healthcare is, to my mind at least, an endocrine issue. If you can't produce estrogen or testosterone, store-bought is fine. But the case here, because there was so much precedence put on, and because the head of the clinic gave so much evidence in the court case, it changed the course of trans healthcare in the UK. If we can continue to the next slide. The Gender Recognition Act and why it's not all that. So the 2004 gender recognition changed the blanket ban on allowing trans people to change their gender marker on their birth certificate. It was brought because of a European High Court, European Court of Human Rights case that stated that it denied trans people the basic human right of right to privacy and the right to a family, which is 8 and 11 respectively. It's problematic. So to this day, it still requires a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. Dysphoria is the cognitive dissonance that trans people feel, very often quite painfully, between their internal self and their physical self. I don't know, there's many ways to describe it. But to me, it's always felt a little bit like I'm made out of lead on particularly bad days. And you have to have a diagnosis of that, but not all trans people experience gender dysphoria. And getting that diagnosis takes up to 2-4 years sometimes. And waiting times are only getting worse. So that makes getting a gender recognition certificate a gate-kept activity. It requires a portfolio of evidence that you are trans. Trans enough, I guess. So you have to put evidence that you've changed your name, and evidence that you're trans, and evidence that you're continuing to be trans, and you send it to a panel of stuffy guys who you never meet, and they rubber stamp it. 99% of them are approved on the spot. You used to have to pay £140 for the privilege. Now it's a £5. If you're married, you have to have a special permission from your spouse to receive a gender recognition certificate. So if you can imagine you've transitioned and your spouse is not particularly happy about the fact that you transitioned, they might well refuse to write that letter, and you wouldn't be able to get a gender recognition certificate. You wouldn't be able to change your birth marker. The fun thing is, under the Equality Act, you can't actually be ordered to produce a GRC, and it isn't actually an indication of your gender. It is a certificate that allows you to change your gender. It's like a token. It's like Monopoly money, basically. And there's still no provision for non-binary folks. You're in one of those two boxes, male or female, the blue box or the pink box, not neither, not both, one or the other. Yeah. So that's there are other things that I've not talked about. There's portrayal of trans people in media. And I don't want to jump from 1969 to 2004 and suggest nothing happened in between, because a lot happened. But in terms of the major beats of trans history in the UK and how we came to be where we are today, that kind of talks about most of it, to me at least. I'm always willing to learn more, but to me, that's the major beats of how we came to be where we're at today, essentially. If I could have the next slide. So this is going to be a little bit heavy, and I do apologize. I do experience joy. I don't really know what to say, but I think it's really important that we talk about the state of transphobia, particularly in this country. I have friends in America who are worried for my safety as a trans feminine person, because they see what's happening in the UK and they're like, my God, so bad. And I'm like, you had President Trump for a while, are you okay? So let's talk a little bit about the state of play, where we're at, where trans people are at the moment. As I've already discussed there, the legal framework for trans ID is terrible. Gender recognition certificate is difficult. Waiting lists for gender affirming medical treatment are very long at the moment. Clinics are oversubscribed, underfunded. One clinic in Leeds, it would currently take, they saw, I think, 5 patients last year. And at that rate, it would take them 9,662 years to clear their waiting list, I believe. There's still no provisions in society for non-binary people. One, the other, not neither. There's been a 352% increase, at least, in reported transphobic hate crimes in the last 5 years. There's a media that's obsessed with us but won't let us speak. there's some media portrayal that goes beyond us being a punchline, but a lot of it involves us being either dead or a sex worker or a dead sex worker or being a punchline. And to say there is nothing wrong with being a sex worker, but there is more ways that trans people exist in this world than merely as sex workers. There's more to us. There's an industry of faux grassroots groups with deep pockets and connections that are speaking about us regularly. And there are increasing numbers of murders of transgender people worldwide. Every year I read the names of the people who are murdered. I've done it for maybe the last 5 years. Sometimes I read it to people, sometimes by myself, sometimes I do it to a camera. That list doesn't ever get shorter. Every year it's more. So that's pretty much where we're at the moment. It's not outstanding. If I could have the next slide, please. So let's talk about 2 steps forward and 1 step back. So I came out in 2013. It was maybe a couple of years after that Time produced that very kind of iconic cover of Laverne Cox that said, "The transgender tipping points, how it was a new frontier for a fight for rights." I mean, we didn't know what a fight it was going to become, but I remember that coming out, and I remember seeing Orange is the New Black, and I remember seeing these things and being like, "Oh, that's really cool." Huh. Changing laws, we've been given increased protection under the Equalities Act. Gender reassignment is a protected characteristic. There are increased sentences for trans hate crimes or perception of people being trans and that being a hate crime. And then there's been an inevitable backlash. As I'm sure you may already know, rights aren't pie. If some person gets given rights, it doesn't mean someone else doesn't have rights. It doesn't take a slice out, you know. It's not a zero-sum game. Here's an example. The Sunday Times in 2016 published 6 news stories about transgender people. The year after, they published over 150. In 2020, it was 324, approximately. This year, by the 24th of May, they had published 223 articles. They are on track so far to be producing over 500 articles about trans people. Here are some examples on the right. It's pretty heavy stuff. This is how much I care for you all. I spend a lot of time digging up headlines from newspapers I object to share. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Yeah, so that's very much where we're at. I want to talk more about the origins of this transphobia and the mechanisms of this transphobia, how it works and what the playbook is. Let's start by talking about the origins. So the origins of modern transphobia can be traced back to 1970s radical feminism. That's a pretty general agreement as to where it comes from. So you're talking about Germaine Greer, you're talking about Janice Raymond. These radical feminists and others portrayed transgender women as being part of the patriarchy, that trans women are in fact men and that they are seeking to colonize female culture and spaces, and that we portray caricatures of femininity. Now, it's worth noting that those caricatures of femininity that they claim that we portray, we are forced to portray in some ways because it keeps us safe by living stealth. And it also allows us to access medical care, which is gate-kept if you don't act in a hyper-feminine way. I used to be a bicycle courier, and I used to just wear combat shorts and a band t-shirt. And one day I had a gender identity clinic appointment. So I rode to the gender identity clinic appointment, locked my bike up. I had my big bag with my radio on it and turned up. And I got given makeup tips during that appointment. That was the one thing I remember. And it got written in my notes that I turned up wearing male attire. This is in 2018, I believe. So yeah, we're kind of forced into portraying this hyperfemininity in order to get through, to obtain affirming treatment that saves lives. in these original texts, as well as in current discourse, trans people, particularly trans women, a lot of these people are very focused on trans women. They don't discuss trans men and they don't discuss non-binary people. Trans men are seen as tragic victims of the transgender movement, which is led by this dark lobby of trans women. You know, we're seen as a problem that needs a solution. In the transsexual empire, I'm not going to read the full title, it has a massive slur in it. Janice Raymond writes, the problem of transsexualism would best be served by morally mandating it out of existence. That's still the end goal of anti-transgender activism, no matter where it's coming from, no matter where the money is coming from, no matter what discussion points they choose to talk about. That is still the goal. The goal is to stop us being, stop us existing. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you, Dara. Now, modern transphobia works in a very interesting way. It's become hard to articulate hardcore transphobia without breaking the law. Libel laws in the UK are particularly strong, and there are increased sentences for crimes aggravated by transphobia, so newspapers are no longer able to print directly transphobic headlines and stories. Generally speaking, they need to gender us correctly, and they can't be horror with us. So much media transphobia is what's known as a dog whistle. Many of you may have heard this term, but if you haven't, allow me to introduce you to it. Dog whistles are those like high-pitched whistles that you can't hear, humans can't hear them, but a dog can. When talking about in this context, a dog whistle is something that appears inane and appears neutral and appears perfectly normal, but has an undercurrent and an implication, a suggestion of something else. So here's a list of some of the examples that you can see of dog whistles. So publishing photographs of non-passing trans women, going, look at this, look at this person. Concerns for children adjacent to trans issues. Won't somebody think of the children? This is, of course, rehashed homophobia from the 1980s and 90s, the common accusation that is completely demonstrably false, that homosexuals are paedophiles, which is complete rubbish. There's that implication made there. I've regularly seen articles that refer to trans people as grooming children to become trans, which is just not true. Insistence in printing for trans people's birth name. Now, generally speaking, style guides suggest you don't do this because it's quite rude and impolite. Certain newspapers still insist on doing it because they want you to know. They want you to know that this person is not who they say they are. They're masquerading, which goes back to the 1930s to 1950s kind of mid-century presentation of trans people as liars, cheats, as being fake, as not being real, not being who they say they are. There's also a focus on trans people who have been convicted of crimes, particularly sex crimes. They focus on an individual and do the whole guilt by association thing, trying to tar an entire group based on the actions of one individual person. And then naturally, there's also an obsession with whether trans people are pre-op or post-op. Some of us are in fact non-op. But there's this obsession with what's in your trousers, as my good friend Leo George puts it. My general answer is that's between me, my doctor, and my deity. Yeah, no. I always say, I remember I had a discussion, the best analogy I can come up with, when you ask a trans person what's in their trousers, the best analogy I've come up with is equivalent to walking up to somebody and saying, do you shave your pubic hair? Maybe you do, maybe you don't, maybe you will in the future, but it's not really something that you need to know if you're just having a conversation with someone in a bus stop or whatever. Yeah, take that one for free. Moving on. So talking more about modern transphobia, saying the loud part quietly. So there's a lot of subjects that are discussed when it vis-a-vis trans people. And you'll always find that the people who discuss these subjects talk about it as regards trans people. And they really, really care very strongly about it. They feel very strongly about it. But they don't talk about the other adjacent issues to do with that thing. It's very similar to when you see men's rights activists on the internet who use it as an excuse to slate feminists that don't really discuss issues that are facing men. So some of the issues that you'll regularly see discussed: sports, trans people in sports. Are trans people being in sports, is that unfair? I can tell you, as someone who can no longer carry all the shopping from the car to the front door in one go, estrogen saps your muscle density and you're left with very heavy bones and less muscle. Definitely not a competitive advantage. There just isn't. At the same time, people who are feel very strongly about fairness in sport and trans women in sport, they don't really talk about doping in professional sport, for example. And I think the thing I really want to focus on here is that it's not just about that. What they are saying is not what they appear to be saying. In talking about trans people in sports, they're not saying, well, you know, it's about fairness in sports. They're saying trans people shouldn't have hobbies. In talking about bathrooms, they're saying trans people shouldn't be able to urinate in public restrooms. In talking about trans people in refuges, they're saying that we shouldn't, if we find ourselves in precarious and vulnerable situations, be able to seek help. We're talking about changing rooms, we shouldn't be able to go out and purchase clothes like anybody else. They're trying to make life inconvenient and make life impossible. And then talking about transgender children is a particular one. I'm just going to have a sip of lemonade before I start on this one. Let me be clear up front. People under 18 are not being given life-changing gender confirmation surgeries. People under 18 are not being given cross-sex hormones. They are being given hormone blockers. These have been used on cis children since the 1960s and are perfectly safe. Studies have borne that out. The effects are reversible if they do decide to desist and go through transition based on their gender assigned at birth. The message when it comes to the discussion of transgender kids is, let's not have any more transgender people. Wouldn't that be horrible? Wouldn't it be horrible if my child was one of those people, meaning us? It breaks my heart because I couldn't have come out at that age. It just wasn't possible. And I see people coming out in their teens, and I see the joy that they're experiencing, being able to be themselves, not being trapped. And it breaks my heart to see that taken away from them. A High Court case in December 2020 led to trans children under the age of 18 on puberty blockers having their medical treatment revoked for 3 months. Medications that they were already on were no longer available to them suddenly. It's not right. And it's never about what they say it's about. Moving on to the next slide, and I am sorry this is heavy. Well, this one's slightly less heavy, I guess. This is what I like to term ridiculosity. So one of the ways in which transgender discourse is derailed is through consistent presentation of seemingly ridiculous things transgender people have demanded. In reality, few or no transgender people are in fact demanding any of these things. And this focus means that we spend a week putting out the fire because Mr. Potato Head has suddenly become trans and going, no, that's not the case. We don't care genuinely about Mr. Potato Head's gender. Can we talk about the waiting lists for the GIC, or can we talk about the abuse that we're facing in the street maybe? No, you want to talk about Mr. Potato Head. Okay, cool. So here are some examples of some frivolous things. Again, you can see the implication. World's first transgender children's doll with penis underneath woman's clothes spotted on sale in toy store. Yeah, again, remember that implication of 1980s, 1990s rehashed homophobia. Yeah, I really want to share this because I know it's not always obvious to everybody when you see it, and it's, to be trans in this current media landscape is to wake up in the morning and open the news or whatever and go, oh God, what now? That's just genuinely it. What is it this week? Is it Mr. Potato Head again? Moving on. I think this is the final sort of subject in terms of how modern transphobia operates that I'd like to discuss. And it's possibly one of the biggest, most dangerous ones. As I mentioned, there are a large number of groups that are opposed to our continued existence and wish to mandate us out of moral acceptance. There's been a movement towards these groups becoming more organized, becoming less amateur and more legitimate appearing. They're not Web 1.0 GeoCities web rings anymore. They're not obscure forums. They have money coming in from right-wing evangelical groups that won't stop after they've got rid of trans people. They will continue to attack the LGBT community. They will attack abortion rights. They will attack contraceptive rights because they've stated this is their game. These groups have a thin veneer. It's known as AstroTurf. And instead of being a grassroots organization that's grown, it's just been rolled out. They have this appearance of being concerned citizens. They're asked for comment on transgender issues in Parliament. They're invited to give evidence for public inquiries about us. They appear on television and radio panels where they compare us to Nazis, Stasi and cockroaches. And all three of those are direct quotes. The last one was in the Houses of Parliament when a group was invited to speak and host a lecture there. I don't want to name any of these groups because they're more powerful than I am and they know the law better than I do. But it's quite clear what they're doing. One of them was recently granted charity status and states that it protects the rights of LGBT people. Again, this is the perfect example of that thing where they're saying one thing, but what they're actually doing is something different. They're not protecting the rights of LGBT people, they are attacking the rights of transgender people. At the moment, specifically in the last week, we've seen a massive pile on Stonewall. They're attacking Stonewall, one of the longest running charities in the UK, and their work. They've long-standingly been attacking Mermaids, a group that supports parents and trans children. This week specifically, they have attacked the Royal Academy of Arts, National Trust, I think last week. It's consistent and it's organized and it's coming from money. And if we don't organize, I don't want to think about what's going to happen. This brings me on to the conclusion of this part, which is encapsulated in one simple statement. There can be no safe debate. There is no war. Discussion on trans issues is frequently described as a debate, in inverted commas. You can see lots of examples here of headlines talking about the trans debate, a welcome shift in the trans debate. This suggests a side in which two sides are equivalent. When one side is trying to maintain their right to exist in society, there can be no debate. When trans existence is debatable, there is room left for our existence to be denied or revoked. Next slide, please. Similarly, the idea there should be a debate on transgender lives. There's also a framing of the fight for trans equality as a war. You can see all of these. The transgender war on everything, I think, is my favorite here. War suggests two belligerent sides willing to fight, seeking to flex power and gain domination over the other. At the moment, trans people are without power and with a tiny voice. I'm sitting talking to 19 lovely people who have come to listen to me waffle on for an hour and a half. And I really appreciate you being here, every single one of you. But at the same time, people are, anti-trans activists are able to put a news story out in the Guardian or the Independent. They're able to get it out to thousands of people. Just this morning, there was an anti-trans campaign from a group that I won't name, who appeared on, I believe, BBC News, Victoria, Derbyshire. There was no trans representation in that particular segment, as far as I'm aware. We're not at war. There is no war. Transgender people are fighting for our continued right to exist. We just want to be. We just want to be left alone. We don't want domination. We don't want to replace anything. We don't want to consume. We just want to be. We're without power and a tiny voice. There is no war, and there can be no safe debate about the existence of trans people. Final slide, please. When I talk about these issues with friends and colleagues, family, housemates, I often look for a silver lining, which can very often be difficult or impossible to find. Juliet Jacks, who's a trans author, was on a podcast I listened to last week, and she quoted this line from Gandhi, which is, yes, it's a cliche, it's a white girl quoting Gandhi. First they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. The 1920s, the early 20th century, was them ignoring us. The 1990s was them laughing at us. Consider the portrayal of trans women in films like Ace Ventura or Trainspotting, where we were punchlines. Where we are now is they are fighting us. Concertedly, with a large amount of money, a large amount of influence, they are writing 500 news stories a year aimed at making us look ridiculous, aimed at denying us our rights. I don't know when the final part comes, but I'm determined that my activism will mean that people who come out after me don't have to deal with the same things that I've had to deal with. And I'd like to conclude with two separate messages. If you're trans, keep being you. They can't stop you living your life as much as they would like to. We live rent-free in their heads, but they do not need to live rent-free in our heads. If you're cisgender, please help stand up for us. We can't do this on our own. The fight for gay rights was not won until homophobia became a gauche and impermissible view to hold in society in general. We can't do this alone. I'd like to finish by thanking you for your time. Hang on to each other. Thank you.